Hello, my name is Abby Vandeveer, and I'm a paintings conservator and restorer at the Mauritshuis. I was the head researcher for a recent project called The Girl in the Spotlight, where we carried out a scientific investigation of the most beloved painting from the Mauritshuis collection, Girl with a Pearl Earring, painted in around 1665 by Johannes Vermeer. Visitors flock from far and wide to come see her, and through images, books, and film, she's become iconic. People are inspired by the girl and often feel a kind of personal connection with her. At the Mauritshuis, we refer to the painting as her or she, as if she's a real person. And the museum often gets questions like, was she a real girl? Did Vermeer have a specific person sitting in front of him when he made this painting? We know that Girl with a Pearl Earring wears a kind of costume. Her yellow jacket could have been worn by a Dutch girl in the 1660s, but her headscarf is meant to evoke an exotic girl from the East. The painting was intended as a tronie, a study of a head or face that portrays a character or a certain type rather than a recognizable person. This was a popular genre in 17th century Dutch paintings. Some scholars have described the facial features of Girl with a Pearl Earring as being idealized or abstract. But our recent examination of the painting has made the image of the girl more personal. In this presentation, I hope to bring you closer to Girl with a Pearl Earring and closer to Vermeer, so that we can focus on how Vermeer painted her. The last time that the girl was thoroughly examined was in 1994, during a restoration treatment. This took place inside a glass enclosure in the Mauritshuis, on view to the public and museum visitors. In 2018, we examined the girl again. This time, we didn't restore the painting, because she's still in a stable condition. We wanted to employ the latest scientific technology to find out how Vermeer painted this iconic artwork and which materials he used. The Girl in the Spotlight project involved two approaches. The first was the analysis of samples, carrying out chemical analyses on tiny fragments of paint that were collected in the 1990s, and a few that were collected specifically for this project. Our second approach was a scientific examination of the whole painting using non-invasive imaging techniques, which have developed dramatically in the last 2 decades. Non-invasive means that the cameras, scanners, and microscopes didn't need to touch the surface of the painting. Over a 2-week period in 2018, an international team of scientists and conservators examined Girl with a Pearl Earring inside of a glass enclosure in view of the museum public. Here's a list of the state-of-the-art examination techniques that we used, and I'll explain some of our results later in this presentation. But first, I want to acknowledge the experts who participated in this project. The Girl in the Spotlight was a Mauritshuis initiative and involved a team of internationally recognized specialists associated with the Netherlands Institute for Conservation, Art and Science. This includes the Rijksmuseum, TU Delft, University of Amsterdam, and the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. And we also work together with many other partners. We wanted to find out as much as we could about the materials and techniques Vermeer used to bring the girl to life. Our research questions were: which materials did Vermeer use and where did they come from? What steps did Vermeer take to create the painting? What did the painting look like originally and how has it changed? And which techniques did Vermeer use to create subtle optical effects? I'll go through our questions one by one to present the results to you. First, which materials did Vermeer use and where did they come from? The most important material is Vermeer's paint. and paint is made up of pigments, which are colored powders, mixed with a binding medium. Here the binding medium is linseed oil, which is typical for 17th century paintings. What we know from this project is that the oil was heated to make it smooth, and some copper was added to make the paint dry faster. The color in Vermeer's paint came from pigments, and here's a list of the pigments that we detected in Girl with a Pearl Earring. These pigments were made from raw materials that originated from all over the world. Thanks to the Dutch involvement in world trade in the 17th century, most of these would have been available for Vermeer to buy in his hometown of Delft. As part of this study, we were able to pinpoint exactly where the raw materials came from. Vermeer used lead white to paint the pearl, the girl's shirt, and her eyes. Lead isotope analysis proved that the lead ore in Vermeer's lead white came from England, specifically from the Peak District region. The yellow ochre in the girl's jacket is made from iron-rich earth that could have been mined in Europe. The organic red pigment is Mexican cochineal, and this was made from insects that live on a cactus in Mexico and South America. It's surprising how much high-quality ultramarine Vermeer used in the girl's headscarf. This blue pigment was more valuable than gold in the 17th century. It was made from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli that came from what is now Afghanistan. One discovery from our project is that the stone might first have been heated at a high temperature, which made it easier to grind and produced a more intense blue color. Another blue pigment used in the background is indigo, which could have come from one of two places: Asia, where it could have been imported by the Dutch East Indies Company, or from America, via the Dutch West Indies Company. So our question, which materials did Vermeer use and where did they come from, not only tells us about where the pigments in Girl with a Pearl Earring come from, but also tell us about Dutch and world trade in the 17th century. So how do we know what kind of pigments Vermeer used? In the 1990s, tiny paint samples were collected, and you can see how tiny they are in the middle picture, the little black dots. These samples were embedded in a block of resin and made into a cross-section so that we could see all of the layers under the microscope. This is what a cross-section looks like under the microscope. We can look at it with different types of light and see the pigments in the different layers of the painting. Then we can analyze the same sample with more advanced techniques like SEM-EDX to identify the chemical elements in the pigments like lead, calcium, or iron. From this tiny sample, we can learn a lot about Vermeer's working process, which pigments he used, and the order in which he applied the layers. In the background, the layers from the bottom up are the canvas, ground, then two paint layers. The paint layers are distinct from each other, and this tells us that Vermeer left the underlayer to dry before applying the upper layer. But this cross-section only tells us about the specific spot where the sample was taken. To find out about where these materials are located throughout the whole painting, we examined Girl with a Pearl Earring using a combination of imaging techniques. Without even having to touch the painting, imaging techniques scanned and mapped materials, even ones that are beneath the surface of the painting. The combination of samples and imaging helps us answer our second research question. What steps did Vermeer take to create the painting? Vermeer started with a woven canvas, and we can see the horizontal and vertical lines of the fabric in the X-ray, and we can map its pattern using computer-assisted canvas analysis. the canvas is covered with a gray ground layer, and the ground is an even tone that made a suitable surface for Vermeer to paint on. He probably bought the canvas pre-prepared with a ground layer rather than applying the ground himself. Vermeer started composing Girl with a Pearl Earring using brown and black paint to sketch the fall of light and shadow, and later he covered this with paint in different colors. We used infrared imaging to detect the brown and black underlayers beneath the surface. If we take a closer look at an infrared image of her jacket, we can see thin black lines that Vermeer used to establish the contour of the girl's jacket against the dark background, and how he planned the shadow on the back of her shoulder with broad, vigorous brushstrokes. These underlayers are hidden beneath the paint that he applied afterwards, but shine through in places where the paint is thin. Vermeer made some changes to the composition during the painting process. If we compare the underlayers on the left and the upper layers on the right, we can see that he shifted the edge of her headscarf upwards and changed the bottom of her ear. After establishing the areas of light and dark in the underlayers, Vermeer worked systematically on each different color area in the painting. He started with the background, then he painted the girl's face, then her yellow jacket, white collar, headscarf, then the final details like her pearl earring. He probably painted his signature last. Many people don't realize that this painting is signed, because nowadays the signature is so difficult to see. With the naked eye, here you can faintly make out the letters of Vermeer. But using a scanning technique like macro X-ray fluorescence, which maps the distribution of different chemical elements, we can visualize the signature more clearly and use them to make a tracing. Nowadays, Vermeer's signature is very difficult to see because of chemical and physical changes that have happened to the background over time, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. These changes disguised another feature in the background, which led to one of the most amazing discoveries in our recent examination. In a polarized light photo, we noticed some diagonal lines in the upper right corner. If we look more closely at this area, we can see faint lines that are slightly lighter than the surrounding paint. And some of our imaging techniques allowed us to visualize them even more clearly. Using optical coherence tomography, we could detect where the underlayer is thicker or thinner. And using macro X-ray fluorescence, we could see these diagonal lines more clearly. In this macro X-ray fluorescence map for lead, you can see several diagonal lines in the upper right and a lighter area in the lower right of the painting. Vermeer mixed more lead white into these areas to create highlights, and this was one of our most exciting new findings. The background is not simply an empty dark space. Vermeer painted the girl in front of a curtain. The diagonal lines are the folds in the fabric of a curtain. Vermeer painted curtains in several of his paintings, but usually in front of the people instead of behind them as a backdrop. The curtain in these two paintings were once dark green, and we think the background of Girl with a Pearl Earring was also dark green when Vermeer painted it. A sample showed us that, in the background, Vermeer first applied a black underlayer, then on top, a paint layer that contains blue and yellow pigments, which we know when mixed together would have made green. But the blue and yellow pigments faded when they were exposed to light. Over time, the curtain in the background, which would originally have been a dark green, has turned into a mottled dark gray, and the folds on the right side are almost invisible today. This is only one of the changes that's happened to Girl with a Pearl Earring over the course of time. One of our research questions was, what did the painting look like originally and how has it changed? And in another presentation, Professor Joris Dick will explain more about how the background would have looked originally, and Dr. Annelies van Loon will talk about changes in the girl's blue headscarf. As a conservator, I'm aware that paintings change over time. Long after the paint is dry, the materials can undergo chemical reactions and form degradation products. For example, palmurite, associated with a red lake pigment. The imaging technique macro XRPD mapped where palmurite has formed in the shadows of her skin. And a micro technique called FibStem showed us exactly where it was forming, between paint layers. This FibStem technique has rarely been used to analyze samples from paintings, but here it was very useful for looking at them at an incredibly small scale. Another change that's happened to the painting over time is that cracks have formed. 3D scanners used in this project made accurate maps of the crack pattern in Girl with a Pearl Earring. We can digitally remove the color information to create a topographical map, from which we can measure the height and depths of the cracks. One of the most important outcomes of this project is that now we have a very accurate document of the condition of the painting at this moment in time, and we can continue monitoring and mitigating any changes that might occur in the future. The last research question of the Girl in the Spotlight project is, which techniques did Vermeer use to create subtle optical effects? Vermeer was the master of depicting light and texture, and we can see his skill by looking at details under the microscope enlarged 140 times. The pearl is an illusion. It has no contour, and also no hook to hang it from the girl's ear. It's just a few brushstrokes of lead white. Vermeer applied the paint thinly to suggest the reflection from the girl's white shirt. And he applied a thicker highlight to show the light coming from the left of the painting and reflecting off the smooth surface of the pearl. The girl's skin is also extremely smooth. The transition from light to shadow is almost imperceptible. Vermeer achieved this in two ways. First, by choosing two different kinds of lead white with different optical and handling properties for the highlight and the shadow. And secondly, by blending the light and shadow together with a dry brush. Remarkably, when we examined the painting under the microscope, we found his brush hairs embedded in the paint of the girl's skin. We made another amazing discovery in the girl's face. Scholars in the past have said that the girl has no eyebrows or eyelashes. But under the microscope, we found tiny dark lines above one of her eyes, and in her other eye, brown eyelashes that extend over the background were revealed using macro XRF scanning. To summarize, the most important new findings of our research are that we discovered the girl's eyelashes, figured out how Vermeer painted her flawless skin, and more about his working process. We saw at a microscopic scale how he observed the effects of light, how and where he signed his painting, and most dramatically, that the girl is in front of a green curtain, placing her in a defined space rather than in a formless dark expanse. All of these findings have brought us closer to Vermeer and the girl than ever before. She might be an iconic image of a girl, but she's also a painting made of a combination of materials that we identified and analyzed at an elemental level. The image you see here is a composite made up of the technical images that we collected as part of this project. Combining and comparing different scientific technologies has provided so much more information than a single technology would have done on its own. The terabytes of data and careful observation have given us the full picture of how Vermeer painted Girl with a Pearl Earring. I'd like to end by thanking all of the researchers and scientists who helped with the Girl in the Spotlight project. And I'd like to draw your attention to some resources where you can find out more information, including an interactive image of the girl at 35 to 140 times magnification, a collection of 10 scientific articles in the journal Heritage Science, written by our research team, and a blog that I wrote about the technical examination. After our scientific examination, we now look at the girl differently, and we hope that you will too.